Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see such a great audience. Looks like we have a nice mixture, plenty of students, lots of faculty and staff, and plenty of community members. So thank you all for coming out on a cold winter's night. And I understand, too, that we are on PIR, Principia Internet Radio, so there might be some Principia friends and some people with interest in history that are listening from hopefully around the country and maybe even from around the world. My name is Hans Fredrickson, and I currently have the pleasure of serving on the Board of Trustees for Principia. And I'm also the proud parent of 3 current Principia students, 2 at Principia College and 1 right here at the school. Well, this evening we're in for a rare treat to learn more about the life and achievements of Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd President of the United States, and arguably one of, if not the, most important Americans of all time. But before I begin my formal introduction, I do want to take a moment to thank the 2 individuals that have made this evening possible. Many of you know Don and Christina Koch. They are longtime members of the Principia community. They are both Principia graduates, and they have generously supported Principia in a number of different ways. This evening's program is funded by the Koch Foundation, whose mission it is to promote the better understanding of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the United States Constitution. And I can think of no better way to do this than to bring the type of speaker we're about to hear from this evening. So Don and Christina, if you will both please stand, we would like to give you a round of applause. President Jefferson was the founder and leader who was best able to articulate our nation's highest ideals and lay the foundation for America's hope and promise. His perseverance and genius helped consolidate the victory of the American Revolution. Our speaker tonight, Eric Petersen, is a great admirer of Thomas Jefferson and is one of the world's foremost Jefferson experts. Mr. Peterson will share his insights as to the character and principles of this extraordinary American. He will address Jefferson's views on many of today's challenges, including religion, government, international force, and diplomacy. Jefferson's views and ideals are as relevant to today's issues as they were when he was president over 200 years ago. Eric is the editor of a book of Thomas Jefferson's writings entitled Light and Liberty, Reflections on the Pursuit of Happiness. In the book, Mr. Petersen has laced together the eloquent genius of Thomas Jefferson after 10 years of studying President Jefferson's writings in reports, state papers, speeches, and over 20,000 letters. 20,000 letters that Jefferson wrote in his lifetime have been kept and are known. And Eric has read all of them. Now here's the interesting part. Eric Petersen is not a professional historian. Putting together this book was not his job, but rather something he did on top of his full-time job. Eric is a managing partner at a major law firm in New York City. Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood is the name of the firm. Eric did study history at Brown University, one of only 8 universities that is part of the Ivy League. And he studied law right here in the Midwest at the University of Chicago. So he's certainly familiar with the Midwest. Now you might ask yourself, why are we here at Principia in the year 2015 interested in Thomas Jefferson? Well, I think there are many reasons. His writings, his ideals, and his qualities tie directly to what we're trying to achieve at Principia, particularly as we focus on character education. Just this morning, right here in this auditorium, all the students attended chapel. The speaker quoted a well-known passage from Mary Baker Eddy, where she talks about living a grand and noble life. Well, few people better exemplify this than Thomas Jefferson, living a grand and noble life. As you read this book, and I know many of you have a copy of this book, but as you read this book, you will find many passages that sound remarkably similar to Mrs. Eddy's writings. Mrs. Eddy was not quite 5 years old when Thomas Jefferson died in 1826. It is hard to imagine that Mrs. Eddy could have written Science and Health or even founded the Christian Science Church were it not for the work done by Thomas Jefferson. Now, the title of the book we're going to hear about tonight is Light and Liberty. And this is what Mrs. Eddy had to say in the preface of Miscellaneous Writings. And I'm just going to read one very short passage. Here's what Mrs. Eddy says. Supported, cheered, I take my pen and pruning hook to learn war no more, and with strong wing to lift my readers above the smoke of conflict into light and liberty. So Mrs. Eddy uses the exact same words, light and liberty, as Thomas Jefferson used, and as is the title of this book. So this is something that Eric will address in his talk this evening. So without further ado, here is Eric Petersen.
Am I audible, Dwight? Okay. Well, thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's presentation on the vision of Thomas Jefferson. As Hans mentioned, my name is Eric Petersen, and I'm the editor of Light and Liberty, Reflections on the Pursuit of Happiness. This is a collection of inspirational essays drawn and pieced together from the writings of the great and the good Thomas Jefferson. I'd like to thank Hans for that gracious introduction. I'd also like to thank Principia for inviting me here to offer this evening's talk. I plan to speak for perhaps 50 or 55 minutes, and our hosts have allowed some time for a book signing afterwards for those of you who may be interested. Before I begin the talk, I'd like to offer my heartfelt thanks to the entire community here at Principia. I've had a wonderful day of exchanges with the students and the faculty, very inspirational day for me, and I'm very honored to be welcomed into your community. And I'd also like to add my thanks to Hans's, to Don and Christina Koch and the Koch Foundation for having the idea of this program, and particularly for their kindness and generosity. They graciously offered hundreds of copies of Light and Liberty to this community, and I think that's worth a second round of applause. Thomas Jefferson was the happiest of men. He once wrote that the giver of life gave it for happiness and not for wretchedness. Wherever he went, he sang or hummed happily to himself. The fiddle or the violin was his instrument, and he was quite accomplished. As a collegian, he played in the governor's weekly quartet ensembles at the Palace in Colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, where he was a student at William and Mary College. And in his sunset years, the music of his grandchildren filled the parlor of his home, Monticello, in Charlottesville, Virginia. Thomas Jefferson loved nature, nature's God, nature's beauty. So eager was he to start every day that the sun, as he said, never caught him in bed for 50 years. He delighted in the culture of the earth, as he put it, in every bud that opens. He spent every possible moment outdoors, regardless of the weather. And even when he was inside, he was conscious of the beauty, the flow, the power, the peace, and the harmony of nature. He once said that there is not a sprig of grass that shoots, uninteresting to me, nor anything that moves. Thomas Jefferson once wrote that nothing makes me more happy than to render any service in my power. And oh, what a life of service did Thomas Jefferson lead. He was born on April 13th, 1743, and he died on the 4th of July, 1826, same day as his friend and rival John Adams, and 50 years to the day after Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. It was a long span of some 83 years, during which time Thomas Jefferson served the public in 9 different public service capacities: 3 legislative, 3 executive, 2 diplomatic, and 1 educational. He was the 3rd president, of course, of the United States of America, serving 2 terms. He was also vice president under John Adams. He served for 2 years during the last 2 years of the Revolutionary War. a particularly bitter time as governor of Virginia. On the legislative side, Thomas Jefferson was, for many years, an elected burgess in the Virginia House of Burgesses before and during the war. He was, of course, an elected delegate from Virginia to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, where, of course, he wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And after the war, he served for one term as a United States congressman when Congress was meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. On the diplomatic side, Thomas Jefferson was our nation's minister to France during the 5-year period leading up to the French Revolution in 1789, where he witnessed the opening scenes of the Revolution. And upon his return to America, he served for another 5 years as America's first Secretary of State or Foreign Minister under President George Washington. And finally, Thomas Jefferson was the founder, the father of the University of Virginia. He conceived of the university, secured funding for it from a reluctant state legislature in difficult economic times, not unlike our own today. He planned the curriculum, hired the professors, acquired the library, and of course, he designed the beautiful architecture that graces the campus of the University of Virginia even today. He once said that if in the course of my life it has been in any degree useful to the cause of humanity, that fact itself bears its full reward. To me, the life, the achievements, and the vision, particularly the vision of Thomas Jefferson, were and remain true and special gifts to our country and indeed to the entire world. He had a brilliant mind, of course, and he also had a vast heart and indeed an illuminating soul. Thomas Jefferson was a seer, a dreamer of a better future for all mankind. Thomas Jefferson's vision is at the heart of what we Americans truly love about our country. And I believe that even still today, it is the single thing about America that people around the world admire and appreciate. It's the vision, of course, of freedom, the rights of man, self-government, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. It's also a vision of oneness, of faith in the average citizen, a belief in the common good and universal harmony, and confidence in an ever brighter future. I like best the way Thomas Jefferson expressed his vision of freedom and oneness, or light and liberty, in one of the early drafts of the Declaration of Independence, where he wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with inherent and unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So let's turn now to the pursuit of happiness, a theme with which Thomas Jefferson is so closely identified. What did he mean by the pursuit of happiness, and how do we actually go about doing it? Well, Thomas Jefferson subscribed to the ancient Greek wisdom, which he summed it up, says that happiness is the aim of life. Virtue is the foundation of happiness, and utility is the test of virtue. This is a very interesting philosophy and one we might usefully apply in our daily lives. He's saying that in order for something to be virtuous, it has to actually work as a practical matter to produce happiness, deep, abiding, inner satisfaction, of course, and not mere passing personal pleasures. He's also saying that happiness rests much more on a moral or even a spiritual foundation than it does on a material or temporal one. He once wrote that the glow of one warm thought is to me worth more than money. Thomas Jefferson believed strongly in happiness as a volitional matter. He felt happiness within our own personal control. He said, our greatest happiness does not depend on the circumstances of life in which chance has placed us, but is always the result of good conscience, good health, occupation, and freedom in all just pursuits. Here are some examples of virtues that Thomas Jefferson particularly admired. And these are expressions contained in the book Light and Liberty. It is wise and well to be contented with what the master of the feast places before us, and to be thankful for what we have, rather than thoughtful about what we have not. Gratitude. It is useless to discuss old bankrupt scores. We should therefore burn our old accounts. Forgiveness, as forgetting is the capstone of forgiving. And finally, of course, 5 of the most significant words ever written: all men are created equal. Humility, as humility is the conviction that no one in their deepest essence is either superior or inferior to anyone else. Thomas Jefferson summed up his happiness philosophy this way: if the wise be the happy man, as the sages say, he must be virtuous also, for without virtue, happiness cannot be. Thomas Jefferson was a strong believer in the importance of fitness. He said that without health, there is no happiness. And attention to health, then, should take the place of every other object. He himself was lean, fit, trim. He enjoyed good health throughout most of his life. He was largely a vegetarian. He said he used meat mainly as a condiment. He urged his friends, as he said, to take a great deal of exercise, and on foot. Of all exercises, he wrote, walking is the best. I have known many great walkers, he said, and heard particular accounts of many more. They never knew or heard of one who was not healthy and long-lived. He believed in the old saying of early to bed, early to rise. He said, sitting up late at night is injurious to health and not useful to the mind. And so what is Thomas Jefferson's recipe for good health, as he put it? Well, it's simple diet, exercise, and the open air, be it state what it will. This is written some 200 years ago. Thomas Jefferson was a strong believer in the importance of industriousness. He himself was the very model of constant productive activity. He said that the idle are the only wretched, and that indolence is a corrosive canker of human happiness. He said idleness begets boredom. Boredom, the hypochondriac, and that the diseased body. No laborious person was ever yet hysterical, he said. Wherever he went, when he traveled about Virginia, he carried with him a small stringed instrument called a kit. It was a miniature violin, and he used it to practice his music quietly in the corners of taverns during stopovers, so as not to disturb the other guests. Thomas Jefferson studied for 12 and 14 hours a day as a student in his teens and 20s, and he wrote letters for 4 hours a day as an adult. How else can you master 7 languages, or most of the known subjects of the day, or leave behind such a vast literary legacy? He said that the whole art of happiness consists in the art of finding useful employment. And finally, Thomas Jefferson was a strong believer in the importance of civility. He himself was dignified, gracious, the very model of a gentleman. Friends who met him described him as free, frank, easy, kind. They said the experience of meeting Thomas Jefferson was like experiencing light from an inexhaustible solar fountain. And said that he won every heart that approached him as certainly as he astonished every mind. He was a strong believer in the importance of social harmony. He said that without social harmony, life would be but a dreary thing. He was convinced, as he said, that political differences need not and should not lead to personal animosity. He wrote that he had never seen an instance of one of 2 disputants convincing the other one by arguing. And he said it was one of the things that made Dr. Franklin, his good friend, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, the most amiable of men in society, never to contradict anybody. If he were urged to announce an opinion, he did so by asking questions, as if for information, or perhaps to suggest doubts. I'd like to turn now to the book itself, Light and Liberty, and speak for a few moments about how I put it together and what I was trying to achieve. Now, Thomas Jefferson never wrote a full book, save one. It was called Notes on the State of Virginia. And it was an interesting book filled with useful, detailed information about every aspect of his native state, along with wise observations about the human condition and the prospects for human progress. And when it was first published in France and later in England, it helped extend his international renown. Instead, he said that his letters were the journal of his life. And I was fortunate enough some years ago now to come into possession of a complete collection of Thomas Jefferson's writings. It was called the Lipscomb and Berg edition, published around the turn of the last century, when the star of the public's appreciation of Thomas Jefferson was beginning the long rise, which ultimately led to the establishment of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., under the wise leadership of President Franklin Roosevelt. And after reading through everything that he wrote with utter awe and amazement, I decided to try to distill his wisdom down to its very essence. For Thomas Jefferson wrote poetic prose, and he expressed ennobling thought. Now, if Light and Liberty is not a biography, for anyone interested in a good biography, I always like to recommend the classics written by the great Dumas Malone and my friend Merrill Peterson. Instead, Light and Liberty is pure Jefferson, his words only, no criticism, no spin, no analysis. My publisher at Random House, David Ebershoff, calls Light and Liberty the book that Thomas Jefferson never wrote, although every word is his. And what I'm trying to do with this project is simply to bring the light of Thomas Jefferson back into the American sky. Now, working on this project was sheer delight. After reading through everything that he wrote, as I mentioned, I selected 1,300, perhaps 1,400 short expressions of his wisdom, a sentence or two, occasionally a short paragraph. And I grouped them together under 34 virtues and good qualities, because as we have heard, Thomas Jefferson believed that virtue is the foundation of happiness. And so I selected themes like aspiration, truth-seeking, sincerity, enthusiasm, love, humility, hope, seeing the good in others, dreaming the impossible, liberty, patriotism, self-discipline, self-giving, self-perfection, qualities that we all seek to develop within ourselves and we all admire and appreciate in other people. And finally, I pieced them together in smooth-flowing essays or chapters as if each piece had been written in a single session. When in fact, each one of the 34 chapters is composed of material drawn from letters to hundreds of correspondence written over many decades. I can't tell you what a joy it was to immerse myself in Thomas Jefferson's thought in this fashion. His wise words are as compelling now as when he wrote them some 200 years ago. He once said, "I never go to bed at night without an hour or half hour's reading of something moral whereon to ruminate in the intervals of sleep." And I continue to harbor the hope that Light and Liberty is one of those bedside books of which Thomas Jefferson would approve. I'd like to turn now to the twin themes of light and liberty, the title that I chose for this collection of Thomas Jefferson's wisdom, starting with liberty, the supreme cause which never had a better friend or a greater champion in the long run of human history. What is liberty? According to Thomas Jefferson, liberty is freedom from coercion. Freedom from coercion. Thomas Jefferson's freedom words inspire us still. "I've sworn on the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." And what are these forms of tyranny? Well, there's tyranny over the government, over the individual, of course. Government over religion. Religion over government. Individual over individual. Nation over nation. Even generation over generation. He once wrote, "We shall all consider ourselves unauthorized to saddle posterity with our debts and morally obligated to pay them ourselves within what may be deemed to be the period of a generation." What is the source of our liberties? Thomas Jefferson had no doubt. There is a divine source. This is the way he put it in his famous Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, written in 1777, and the first law in the history of the world to provide unequivocally for freedom of conscience over a large expanse of territory. "Almighty God hath created the mind free, and manifested his supreme will that free it shall remain by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint. Or this from his summary view of the rights of British America, written in 1774, in the first pamphlet to take America's true ground in favor of independence from Great Britain. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy, but cannot disjoin them, that is, cannot disjoin life and liberty. And so coercion is wrong because it violates fundamental, naturally given rights. And coercion is unvirtuous because it simply doesn't work as a practical matter to produce human happiness. Thomas Jefferson asked this question: is uniformity attainable? Can I coerce you to think like me, or act like I want you to act, or vice versa? And he answers this question this way: is uniformity attainable? Millions of innocent men, women, and children, since the introduction of Christianity, have been burnt, tortured, fined, and imprisoned, and yet we have not advanced 1 inch toward uniformity. And so we may ask with Thomas Jefferson, is coercion exercised to advance a presumed virtue, itself virtuous? And now to light, the other half of Thomas Jefferson's duality. He once wrote that light and liberty go together. No light, no liberty. And so what is light? According to Thomas Jefferson, light is freedom from ignorance. Freedom from ignorance. This is the way he put the connection. If a nation expects to be both ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. And so what is ignorance? According to Thomas Jefferson, ignorance is not only an absence of learning and knowledge, but more fundamentally, it's an excessive focus on what separates and divides us, on our differences, rather than what we have in common, what makes us all one people. In its worst form, of course, ignorance is tribalism, barbarity, cruelty, violence. How do you overcome ignorance? Mr. Jefferson believed there was only one way, through education. He was one of history's first and greatest champions of public education. During his legislative outpouring in the late 1770s in Virginia, where he single-handedly rewrote the entire code of laws of the newly free state of Virginia, he wrote a bill called a Bill for the More General Diffusion of Knowledge. It was radical. It called for the education of very young kids in the first, second, and third grade at public expense. He was so far ahead of his time that neither that law nor anything like it passed the Virginia legislature during the remaining 45 years of his life. Thomas Jefferson summed up his philosophy of light and liberty this way: enlighten the people generally, and tyranny and oppression of body and mind will vanish like evil spirits at the dawn of day. And what is light on a societal basis? Mr. Jefferson believed that light on a societal basis was a spirit of reason, candor, moderation, tolerance, respect, mild laws readily obeyed, and valuing self-government above all other blessings. And so you can look around the world today and ask yourself, does this nation in the Middle East, or this other nation in Eurasia, or that nation in Africa have enough light to acquire and to sustain liberty? It's a good question. In many cases, they've obviously got a ways to go. Mr. Jefferson was a great optimist. He wrote once that the ball of liberty is now so firmly in motion that it will roll around the world. This, of course, written at a time when there was no liberty anywhere. He was also a man of great patience. He said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. But even here in America, we can ask ourselves the same question. Does America have enough light to sustain its liberty? Can this be so when so much of our public discourse is characterized by disrespect, contempt, even hatred? When the common good is a phrase you don't hear too much anymore, it almost sounds quaint. And when so many of our fellow citizens who are eligible don't even take the trouble to vote, does America have enough light to sustain its liberty? I read recently that in the recent election, only 36% of our fellow citizens voted. And of younger people, only 21% voted. Does America have enough light to sustain liberty? Do we value self-government above all other blessings? For those who do take the trouble to vote, Mr. Jefferson had some simple questions that he thought should be asked of candidates for public office. And here they are. Is he honest? Is he or she capable? Is he faithful to the Constitution? And is he a friend of peace and a friend of economy and the public expense? Thomas Jefferson was a longtime thinker on the subject of good government. He believed that government has only two legitimate objects: the equal rights of man and the happiness of every individual. He believed that you place under every individual what his own eye and hand may personally supervise. He was a strong believer in our nation's federal system of government, with limited power at the central government level, more at the state level, most at the local level, the level closest to the people. And of course, at each level of government, you take power and you divide that three ways: legislative, executive, judicial. When you have the legislative power, you divide that in two, wherever you can, a bicameral legislature. And why is it necessary to smash, fracture, scatter, check, and balance power in this fashion? It's because, as Mr. Jefferson said, I do not agree that 14 out of 15 people are rogues, but I do believe that rogues would be uppermost. In other words, he believed in the decency of the average citizen, but he felt that those interested in greed and power would tend to seek the highest offices. And were they successful in attaining those offices, their tendency toward roguish behavior needed to be checked and constrained. I often like to tell my friends that we here in America are really fortunate because we had Thomas Jefferson, and so much of the rest of the world had Napoleon, or Napoleon's equal. Here we're organized from the individual up and not from the ruler down. Thomas Jefferson was a fiercely independent thinker. He once wrote, "I am of a sect by myself, as far as I know. If I could not go to heaven, but with a party, I would not go there at all." He constantly urged young people to think for themselves and to develop a useful personal life philosophy. He said that the relations which exist between man and his maker and the duties resulting from those relations are the most interesting and important to every human being and the most incumbent upon his study and investigation. He believed, of course, in the importance of human reason, and enlightened human reason. He said every man's reason should be his own oracle. He believed as well in the importance of our conscience. He called our conscience our faithful inner monitor. He said that conscience is the only sure clue which will guide us free and clear of all doubts and inconsistencies. He subscribed to the old sayings of think for yourself, mind your own business, live and let live. He said, I never told my religion, nor scrutinized that of another. I never attempted to make a convert, nor wished to change another's creed. And so, faith is a subject that we don't ordinarily associate with Thomas Jefferson. After all, when he ran for president in the year 1800, he was bitterly attacked, particularly by the clergy in New England, as a fanatic in politics, an atheist in religion, for his support of the democratic aspirations of the French Revolution, and for his support, as he famously put it, of building a wall of separation between church and state, between the power of organized religion and the power of civil government. For he written sentiments like this: it does me no injury if my neighbor believes there are 20 gods, or no God, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Or this: history furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government. And yet, Thomas Jefferson was a man of faith. He had a deep, private, personal, spiritual faith, you might say today. His faith was intuitive as well as reasoned. It proceeded from his heart as well as from his head. He would occasionally use the phrase, "our religion," in his public addresses, by which he simply meant a belief in a common belief in a benign creator and sustainer and transformer of the universe, which is common to all religions. He rarely used the term sacred, except to describe the rights of man, the naturally given rights of man, the rights that are enshrined forever in our federal and state constitutions. The right to freedom of religion, always, of course, to Thomas Jefferson, the first freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, right to trial by jury, freedom from arbitrary governmental arrest and imprisonment. And Thomas Jefferson believed in the souls of nations, as well as the souls of individuals. He once famously referred to the Declaration of Independence as merely an expression of the American mind. But he also referred to it as the genuine effusion of the soul of our country at that time. And Thomas Jefferson wrote this: "Faith and works will show their worth by their weight in the scales of eternal justice before God's tribunal." Thomas Jefferson was also a lifelong thinker on the subject of the proper use of national power. During his day, of course, England and France were the great world powers. He called England the Leviathan of the ocean, France the mammoth of the land. America, a mere 5 million strong, he called the fragile plant of liberty. It was constantly being tossed about and trampled in the eternal wars of vanity and imperialism. He foresaw the day when America might rise to become a great world power. And he offers us this advice from the School of Hard Knocks: "I hope our wisdom will grow with our power and teach us that the less we use our power, the greater it shall be." In other words, if a strong nation shows some restraint in the exercise of military or economic power, it would actually gain more in the friendship, respect, esteem, and cooperation of people around the world than would actually gain from the use of the power itself. I had the occasion a few years ago to attend the dedication ceremony of a new library at West Point, the United States Military Academy. It was named after President Jefferson, who was president at the time that the West Point was established. On the archway as you enter the library is this very saying: "I hope our wisdom will grow with our power and teach us that the less we use our power, the greater it shall be." So all succeeding generations of cadets will be passing into this archway, hopefully imbibing some of this great wisdom from Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that every nation, that every man and every body of men possesses the right of self-government. I govern myself, you govern yourself. My nation governs itself, your nation governs itself. It's our right, it's our duty. And so he was against every form of coercion, domination, force, interfering, meddling in the affairs of others, whether on an interpersonal basis or on an international basis. Thomas Jefferson wrote this: "There be one thing more deeply rooted in the mind of every American than any other. It is that we should have nothing to do with conquest." These ideas naturally led Thomas Jefferson to clear principles on the subject of war and peace. When he sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark out here from St. Louis on their famous voyage of discovery, he had them carry with them a wooden crate filled with heavy-duty, handsomely struck bronze medals. They were the Indian peace medals. They were to be given by Lewis and Clark to the various Indian tribal chiefs that they were expected to meet along the way. On the front of the medal is the profile image of Thomas Jefferson, the one that's been on the American nickel coin for so long, and the words "Thomas Jefferson, President, U.S., 1801. On the reverse side, there's an image of a tomahawk, an Indian implement of war, overlaid by a peace pipe. Also an image of a handshake, a gesture of respectful and equal greeting that Thomas Jefferson was instrumental in popularizing in our country at a time when people were still bowing to their political or economic or diplomatic betters. And finally, the words peace and friendship, reflecting Thomas Jefferson's philosophy, as he put it, that peace and friendship with all mankind is our wisest policy. Now, everyone, of course, is opposed to war. Who isn't? The only question is how deep the aversion really is. Thomas Jefferson's aversion to war was profound. He said, "I abhor war, and I view it as the greatest scourge of mankind. If nations were to go to war for every degree of injury, there would never be peace on earth." He saw 3 wars: the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, the Revolutionary War of American Independence, and the War of 1812. And he concluded, as he said, that war is as much a punishment to the punisher as it is to the sufferer. The truth we can see yet again today. Now, he's not, of course, an absolute pacifist. Declaration of Independence is as much a declaration of war as it is of rights and independence. When he had the chance during his first term as president, he sent the United States Marines over to the north coast of Africa to attack the infamous Barbary pirates, who had been extorting American maritime interests in that region during the entire 30-year period since he'd served over there as our nation's minister to France. But on the other hand, during his second term as president, the British attacked and boarded an American warship called the Chesapeake, and they killed 4 American sailors. War cries rose up and down the East Coast. Instead, Thomas Jefferson pursued a policy of economic embargo, hoping to bring the belligerent nation to its senses. And he later wrote that I was never so pleased to hold power and have the confidence of the people as I was at the time of the incident of the Chesapeake, where I was able to use both for the prevention of war and the preservation of peace. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Peace is our passion." He said that the happiness of mankind is best promoted by the useful pursuits of peace. And he wrote that the lamentable recourse of war should be reserved for actual injuries only and not for evils of the imagination. I'd like to talk for a minute now about the Civil Revolution of 1800, as Thomas Jefferson called it. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, the 1790s was a time of bitter partisan division in the newly created United States of America. The country was under the control of the ruling Federalist Party, the party of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams, and the High Federalists in New England. They were opposed by the Democratic Republican Party, the party of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. Thomas Jefferson described the difference this way. One side, the Federalist side, feared most the ignorance of the people. His side, the Democratic Republican side, he said, feared most the selfishness of rulers, independent of the people. He had attended a dinner with Mr. Hamilton in New York City in 1790, and he heard Mr. Hamilton refer to the people as the great beast. He didn't trust the people. And that was the clash of the 1790s. And as the French Revolution wore on, in France, seeking their rights of man and taking some sorry turns, a lot of people in the United States were interested in that. They staged torchlight rallies, they had political gatherings, volunteer associations. They didn't think it was appropriate to participate in your self-government by voting once every 4 years and forgetting it. They were active in their self-government week after week in a very public way. This really concerned the Federalists. And then they started building up war fever with France. They increased the military, increased the national debt, increased taxes. So concerned were they about what they called the mobocracy, represented by Mr. Jefferson's party. And then they went too far. They passed the Sedition Act of 1798. The Sedition Act made it a federal crime to merely utter an opinion critical of the great Adams administration. Under the Sedition Act, 24 newspaper editors were arrested, all from Mr. Jefferson's party, of course, and there weren't that many more. 14 were prosecuted by federal prosecutors. 10 were convicted, fined and jailed, and many of them were rotting in jail as political prisoners when Mr. Jefferson took office 2 years later. Mr. Jefferson and his friend Mr. Madison fought back with their secretly authored but now well-known Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which said that the Sedition Act was an infringement on the new constitutionally guaranteed rights of free speech and the free press. Mr. Jefferson was not only our nation's visionary, but he was also a great political strategist and tactician. He organized strong political parties in all 13 states, first time that had ever been done anywhere in the world. And he and his party decisively triumphed in the election of 1800. He immediately moved to bring the country together. In his inaugural address, he said, "We're all Federalists. We're all Republicans. In other words, we're all united in principles higher than party." He simmered down the war fever further. He reduced the size of the military. He reduced taxes. He paid down the national debt by 1/3. He appointed office holders largely on the basis of merit, not political affiliation, as the Federalists have been doing. And I think most importantly, he let the Sedition Act expire rather than extending it and turning it on his political enemies, the normal course of events in all of human history. And by these magnanimous and far-sighted acts, he actually established free speech and freedom of the press in our country for all time to follow, principles that we still enjoy today, and they're very, very well established. This is the civil revolution of 1800, as Thomas Jefferson called it. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, James Monroe, Benjamin Franklin, George Mason, all the greats of the founding of our country were students of history. They were well aware of the ancient Greek and Roman experiments in democracy and self-government and the long 1,000-year period of stagnation and darkness that followed. And they were well aware that they had a once-in-a-millennium opportunity to establish the rights of man and self-government on such a large scale that they can never be truly threatened from the outside. Mr. Jefferson called the United States Constitution the primitive and precious model of what is to change the condition of man all over the globe. He called America the hallowed ark of human hope and happiness. And he said that America possesses the sacred fire of freedom and self-government, from whence it's to be lighted up in other regions of the earth, should other regions ever become susceptible of its benign influence. As I've worked on this Light and Liberty project, I've been struck by how much Thomas Jefferson is admired and appreciated by people around the world, perhaps even more so than he is here in America. We had some wonderful comments on the book, Light and Liberty. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for example, the great reconciler of the races in South Africa, said that Thomas Jefferson's wisdom in Light and Liberty has the power to capture the imagination and inspire those of us in the present-day world to again dream great dreams and do good deeds. And Mikhail Gorbachev, the great President Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, freer of hundreds of millions of people without firing a shot, and liberator of the world from the threat of massive nuclear annihilation. The great Mikhail Gorbachev said that Thomas Jefferson's wisdom in Light and Liberty has many valuable lessons to teach us as we are learning to live together in harmony and strengthen relations with one another. Thomas Jefferson was a great American optimist. He said that it is part of the American character to consider nothing as desperate and to meet and surmount every obstacle with resolution and contrivance. He had confidence in the people. He said that the good sense of the people will direct the boat ultimately to its proper point. He was confident in the future. He said, "I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past." He knew there'd be bumps in the road of human progress. He said, "We too shall encounter follies, but if great, they will be short. If long, they will be light, and the vigor of our people will get the better of them." And Thomas Jefferson was a great foe of fear and appeals to fear. He said that in order to procure tranquility, we must avoid fear and desire, which he called the two principal diseases of the human mind. And he wrote this to John Adams: "How much pain have cost us the evils which have never happened. In other words, as we might say today, don't worry, be happy. Thomas Jefferson is buried on the side of the mountain near his home, Monticello, in Charlottesville, Virginia. Well worth the trip for those of you who may never have had the opportunity or the pleasure. He's buried beneath a 12-foot-high granite obelisk grave marker that bears the epitaph that Thomas Jefferson himself composed. Here is buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence and of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. So even from eternity, Thomas Jefferson is counseling us to stand for liberty and against coercion, to stand for a light and against ignorance. Toward the end of his long and glorious life, Thomas Jefferson received a letter from a complete stranger. He could never fail to answer these letters. This one was from a Mr. Smith, asking for some advice that could be given to his very young child and Thomas Jefferson's namesake, Thomas Jefferson Smith, when young Tommy was old enough to understand it. And wouldn't it be great, this is what he wrote back, and wouldn't it be great if all of us in our formative years could receive this kind of wisdom from Mr. Jefferson? Adore God. Reverence and cherish your parents. Love your neighbor as yourself and your country more than life. Be just, be true, and murmur not at the ways of providence. And the life into which you have entered will be one of eternal and ineffable bliss. Looking back on his own magnificent life, Thomas Jefferson had this to say. And again, wouldn't it be great if all of us in our sunset years could say the same thing in all sincerity? I've done for my country and for all mankind all that I could do. And I now resign my soul without fear to my God, my daughter, to my country. I'd like to close with one more gem from Thomas Jefferson's sublime moral philosophy. All this, my friend, is offered merely for your consideration and judgment, and without presuming to anticipate what you alone are qualified to decide for yourself. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being here. You've been a great audience. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for that. Thank you for those very inspiring words. Obviously, a lot of things for us to think about, to absorb, some huge ideals to live up to. I love the idea of a vast heart and an illuminating soul. And I think if we can all strive to have a bigger heart and an illuminating soul, that would be a wonderful achievement. Eric is going to be out in the lobby, so we're going to let him actually go down and go out into the lobby before we all rise. Thank you. I think a number of students have already received a book. The students that have not received a book, there are books available for you out there. People will be handing those out. And if you would like Eric to sign his name on your book, feel free to do so. He probably will not have time for kind of a detailed or a personal inscription, but it certainly would be wonderful to have his name in your very own book that I think you will treasure and read, hopefully for many years to come. So as Eric leaves the auditorium, let's just give him one more round of applause. Thank you all very much.